The Kansas Reflector staff is taking a look back at 2025 to share their favorite stories and what you all read the most.
The story I wrote this year that was the most read online was a mayor in Coldwater, Kansas, who was arrested for voter fraud. He is an immigrant, a legal permanent resident, but he was not supposed to vote. And in November, Attorney General Chris Kobach announced that in looking and matching the database that they use on the federal level with people who were voting who weren't supposed to be, that he was identified as someone who had voted in elections when he should not. That story got a lot of attention and the most readership. It was one that turned out to be, I did not follow through on it because it wasn't something that I continued to cover other than the fact that the mayor did eventually resign. But it was one that turned out to cause a lot of consternation for the folks who live in Coldwater, Kansas, and who really knew Joe well and were very attached to him and were pretty upset that this was happening to him. He could potentially face deportation depending on what is determined as his trial goes forward. So that was the one that was the most read. The story that I have a really tough time figuring out what is my favorite story that I cover. I am definitely in reporting because I love learning things. So a lot of times my favorite story is the next one coming up because I'm interested in what it's all about and all the details. It's one of the reasons that I love covering energy, which is a very complex topic. But I think I have a couple of favorites, but probably my favorite this year was just a little bit about resilience. Sherman Smith, Kansas Reflector editor, and I went out to Grinnell, Kansas, to see how they were recovering from a tornado that hit their town. And it was just an amazing story. And again, it's one of those things that reminds you how important our neighbors and friends are as we go through things like that. Part of this town, quite a few houses were just destroyed. As I walked the streets and talked to a lot of the people, they talked about how they didn't even know a tornado was coming, and a neighbor popped over and said, "Hey, can I go in your basement? Or do you need to come over and come in my basement?" And that was just a story I heard repeated so many times. Donations flooded into the town from across the country. People who had been in the Joplin tornado brought truckloads up from Missouri. People who had been in other tornadoes and situations like this also brought truckloads of things. There were so many things put together that they had taken over a deserted grocery store on their downtown Main Street and filled it up with things that people could just come in and get what they needed, whether they were household supplies or clothing or things like that. And I think those stories just serve to remind me sometimes when you're in the news world, you're oftentimes covering just really tough subjects. And it really reminded me of how much people do really care about each other and how we all come together. And that is not something that you just see in small towns like that, but I see that in my reporting all the time. So that was my favorite story this year, just because of the people and the resilience that I saw in that town.